John woke before the sun, the way he always did, when the house was still and the light was only a gray hint at the edge of the blinds, and he cut thick slices from the crusty loaf he liked from the bakery 2 blocks away, the kind with a crackle when the knife pressed down, and a smell that filled the kitchen with warm air. The butter softened on a small plate, the kettle clicked toward a boil, and his phone vibrated across the counter with a hard little dance that made the knife pause mid-slice. He looked down and saw the name he avoided more than he admitted, Nathan, his black son-in-law with the smooth voice and the smile that never reached his eyes. John wiped his hands on a towel and answered, saying, "Yes, Nathan," in the even tone he kept for people who like to win small games. Nathan sounded cheerful, too cheerful for the hour, and said his parents had just flown in from France and they were hosting a small dinner tomorrow evening. Very intimate, just family, 7:30 sharp, dressed nicely. His parents were old school. It would mean a lot if John came. John asked why Camille had not called, and for a second the line went quiet in a way you can feel in your teeth. Then Nathan said she was busy, the kids, the planning, she had probably forgotten. John said she isn't forgetful and let the words sit there, flat and true. Nathan chuckled like he was brushing lint from a jacket, said he loved John's directness and wrapped the call in polite phrases. When it ended, the kitchen felt different, like the air had a weight to it, and John set the phone down and looked at the butter beating at the edges and the loaf leaning on the board, and thought about the way Nathan had issued the words like a schedule, not an invitation. He made tea and did not drink it, then did what he always did when his thoughts felt loud. He worked with his hands. He pulled on old shoes and went into the garden, trimmed rosemary that did not need trimming, pinched the tops from basil, and watered soil still dark from last night's rain. He told himself it was maintenance, but he knew it was a way to quiet the talk inside him. At noon he shaved with care, the slow kind that makes your face feel new, and he pressed a clean white shirt, then laid out the great blazer he had bought in Bordeaux years ago, ran a lint brush over the fabric, and polished the brown shoes that still fit well. He remembered the narrow streets by the river, the baker who knew his name, the office near Place de la Bourse where he learned how to listen more than speak. 10 whole years of living that had settled into his bones. He did not tell many people about those years because no one asked, and because the best parts of a life do not need to be shown to be real. By 7 the next evening, he was on Nathan and Camille Street, the one with houses that looked like a row of mirrors. Same porch, same lights, same idea of a home stamped again and again. He parked, walked up the clean path, and the door opened before he touched the bell. Camille stood there with surprise on her face and relief behind it, said, "Dad, you came?" And he said, "Nathan invited me." And she said she was going to call, and he nodded and let that pass, because this was not the moment to sort the truth from the excuse. Inside, the house smelled like butter and garlic and something rich and slow, duck maybe or lamb, a French menu for French guests. The table was set with soft light, linen napkins, and silver that had been polished for the occasion. Nathan's parents were already seated, Luke, tall and spare, with the look of a man who had been in charge all his life, and Marianne, elegant and still, with pearls that sat exactly where they should. Nathan stood at the head of the table, cheerful, stepping toward John with a practiced warmth, and he said, "Here he is, the man of quiet tastes," like it was a compliment, but also an instruction for how to view him. John shook hands, looked Luke in the eye just long enough, and inclined his head to Marianne, who smiled back with the exact amount of smile required. He took his seat. He noticed the wine before anyone explained it. White from the Loire, crisp, young, but he said nothing about it yet. The first plates came, small squares of foie gras on toast with a faint shine of sweetness. And Nathan kept the talk moving with easy topics. Travel that sounded like lists, work that sounded like titles, the children and their piano teacher. Camille tried to keep the rhythm smooth. She asked John about the garden, and he gave simple answers, and he could feel Nathan's eyes slide away as soon as the words left his mouth. The second pour of wine touched the rims, and something in the room shifted. Not a loud turn, just a slide, like a rug being pulled a few inches under the table. Luke spoke to Marianne in French, low and easy, and then kept going, and Nathan followed, and their voices softened in that way people use when they think privacy is a language. John looked at the flame of the candle and listened. He had spent 10 years with this music, the sounds and steps of it, the way an insult can be dressed in silk so it feels like a compliment if you don't know how to touch the fabric. Marianne said the word provincial in the tone some people say for a stain, and her eyes went to John's shoes as if they were a map of his mind. Luke made a small joke about American suits and the men who think a clean shirt makes them interesting. Nathan laughed first, quick and bright, as if he wanted to prove he was fluent not only in words, but in the family's private weather. Camille smiled, because it was polite to smile, and because she did not catch the drift. John held his fork in the way they were about to mock and kept eating. He kept his breath slow and his face still, and watched the edges of their mouths more than their eyes. He heard the measured cuts, small, careful, and sure, and he saw the way Nathan's shoulders loosened when the French words arrived, like he had stepped into his parents' living room even while sitting at his own table. John said nothing in French and nothing in English. He let the room be as it wanted to be. When the main dish came, rich and dark, with a red poured that carried pepper and stone, the comments turned quieter but closer to the bone, and the laughter tucked itself behind sips. For a moment, when Camille stood to check on the children upstairs, the table changed shape. Nathan leaned in toward his parents, Marianne adjusted her pearls, Luke's mouth pulled into a small private line, and John knew the shape of what would happen next, not the details yet, but the outline. They would keep speaking as if he were furniture, they would file him under harmless, and they would leave the night pleased with themselves. He placed his napkin on his knee again, folded clean, and decided he would not correct them, not here, not now. He would not trade a quiet truth for a loud scene. Silence, used right, can be a doorway. He lifted his glass, took one measured sip, and kept his eyes on the tablecloth as if it were a page he could write on later, because later had already begun forming in his mind like letters rising through water. They moved through the courses like a train through stations, each plate arriving on time with a practiced smile, and the talk slid fully into French the way a river chooses the deeper channel. Luke spoke first, low and smooth, saying John had the air of a provincial who wore a clean shirt as if it were character, and Marianne answered with a light "oui" and a small sigh that carried more weight than any word, her eyes falling again to John's shoes, as if leather told a story. Nathan joined them, not leading but echoing, testing sounds he had learned at home, trying on his parents' tone like a borrowed jacket, and he laughed before they finished their lines because he knew where the laugh was meant to land. John ate, not quickly, not slow, a man measuring bites, and let the language do what it wanted because he owned it too, and it could not hurt him the way they hoped. He noted phrases the way a clerk notes numbers, provincial, il fait un effort, impressionné, and he watched how the words sat in the mouth, not the dictionary meaning, but the aim, the angle, the neat little cuts you can hide in courtesy. Camille, kind and busy, smiled at rhythms she could not read and asked Nathan's mother if the tart needed more cream, and Marianne said the cream was fine and added in French that Americans think fat is the same as taste. And Nathan laughed again, a half-second late, pleased to be included. John placed his glass down softly, as if the wood might bruise, and answered a question about his garden in English, a simple sentence about basil going wild after the rain, and Luke added in French that at least the old man had soil to keep him quiet. And there was that same small laughter, trained and tidy, like flicking dust from a sleeve. John did not lift his eyes. He let the candle make a small lake of light in the wine and remembered other tables. Bistros near the Garonne, where the baker and the bookseller argued about rugby and poetry and then split a bottle with him like it was church. A client's kitchen in Talence, where the children corrected his accent and their grandmother insisted he take the last prune. A narrow room in Toulouse, where a man with oil on his hands talked grape yield and taxes until midnight. And he thought how those rooms gave sharp opinions without turning anyone into a joke.
how you could disagree without shrinking the person in front of you. Here, the plan was smaller. Make the guest feel lucky to have a chair. When the cassoulet arrived, the room smelled of smoke and beans and thyme, and a deeper red hit the glasses with a soft ring. Nathan raised his to family in English, and then in French added a line about not all family being built the same, which sounded like a joke about marriage until you listened to the way he watched his parents for approval. John swallowed, and the warmth in his chest was food, not feeling. The waiter cleared, wiped, and poured coffee, and in that small pause, spoon set, cream offered, sugar placed, Mary Ann said in French that John held his fork like a man who learned late and never learned right. And Luke said the voice matched the fork. And Nathan said perhaps they could let him wash the dishes while the adults discussed wine. The room chuckled. The coffee steamed.
John breathed in the bitter and let it sit. He had spent too many meetings with men who enjoyed underestimating the quiet person to think this was new. Silence, used right, is a ledger. You write down what is owed. Camille stood to check on the children, and it was as if a thin film tore. Nathan's shoulders dropped. His grin widened. He leaned closer to his parents, and the French got looser, the edges a shade sharper, secure in the idea that the man across from them was furniture with a pulse. John set his napkin down, lifted it again, and mentally penned the time, the order, the phrases, the softest cuts most of all. He would need the order later. After dessert, a neat, high-gloss tart with apples arranged like roof tiles, Nathan clapped his hands softly as if closing a show, returned to English, and thanked his parents for bringing a little bit of France to the evening. Luke smiled the way men smile when a meeting has gone as planned. Mary Ann reached for her pearls. Camille came back with the air of someone trying to keep a room level. John stood, thanked them, said dinner was excellent, and meant it in the narrow sense that belonged to the food and the skill of the hands who made it. Nathan shook his hand with warmth, so practiced it felt like a well-ironed shirt. Luke's grip was dry. Mary Ann offered her cheek, cool and exact. At the door, Camille squeezed John's fingers and said, "Call me when you get home," the way children do even when they are grown. And he said he would. And then he stepped out into the night that smelled faintly of wet pavement and lemon from a neighbor's tree. He drove home without the radio, letting the engine be a clock, picturing the room he had left not as a wound but as a set of facts. He hung his blazer, laid out his shirt for the wash, and put the polished shoes back into their old box. Then sat at his desk and turned on the lamp that threw a small circle on the wood. He took a sheet of paper, not the cheap pad, good paper makes the hand behave, and wrote the date, the names, the seating, and then, line by line, wrote what had been said. Not the gist, but the words. French on the left, English on the right, with small notes in the margins where tone had done the work that vocabulary pretends to do. He kept the sentences short and placed each phrase where it had lived in time, from the first, provincial, to the last, let him wash the dishes. Because order proves intention, and intention proves truth. When the first page filled, he made a second, and then a third, the coffee from his own pot cooling beside him, the house very quiet in the way only houses with one person in them know. He did not feel rage, not the hot kind that asks to be fed. What he felt was a clean hinge turn, a click of purpose, as if a drawer had been opened that had always been there. When he finished, he set the pages aside and wrote one short line at the bottom in careful script. A sentence in French that said simply, "I have heard you for a long time. Now it is my turn." He slid the papers into a thick envelope, weighed it in his hand, and pictured the moment it would open on their table, their faces bending toward it with that same small confidence they had used on him. He placed the envelope on the corner of the desk, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dim hall, listening to the silence settle like dust. And for the first time that day, he smiled, not wide, not mean, just sure, because the room had spoken, and he had listened, and tomorrow, without a raised voice or a single scene, John mailed the thick envelope first thing in the morning, insured and tracked, then brewed fresh coffee and opened his old leather notebook to a clean page. He wrote a short list in block letters. Call Thomas, research Lemaitre Vineyard filings, confirm export licenses, set up LLC. And underlined each item once, not for drama, but to keep his hands moving in the right order. Thomas answered on the second ring, the same calm banker's voice John trusted for clean introductions. And John said he needed quiet entry into a small French wine company outside Ox, minority only, no spotlight, no meetings where his name would be read aloud. Thomas asked the family name, and John said Luke and Marianne Lemaitre, and he heard the small exhale that meant recognition. Thomas said they were respected, proud, pushing harder into the U.S., and that pride sometimes made men hurry. John said pride had also made them sloppy at a dinner table, and he wanted a seat in the room where pride would be tested by paperwork. By noon, Thomas had sent an email with 2 names for counsel and 1 for a boutique intermediary who specialized in private placements that did not splash. John called the intermediary, a careful man who asked 3 questions in a row. How much, how quiet, how long? And John said, modest, very, and long enough. He did not say revenge. He said stewardship, because that was the honest word for what he meant to do. Watch, wait, record, and press only when the line bent the wrong way. In the afternoon, he drove to the small office park on the ridge where a registered agent kept the lights on for 100 clean companies with no signage, and he filled out the documents for an LLC in Wyoming. L.S. Moreau Partners, chosen from his mother's side, an old name with soft edges and no link to John on any public page. He paid the fee, declined the mail forwarding pitch, and walked out with a folder that was both nothing and everything. Back home, he moved money that had been sitting in a quiet fund for years, the kind of steady cash he liked because it did not talk, and he wired the first tranche to the escrow account the intermediary named. 2 days passed in that slow way a plan uses to become real, and in that time, the courier's tracking said the dinner transcript had been delivered and signed for at 10:42 a.m. John pictured the envelope opened on a neat stone counter, French on the left, English on the right, the footnotes like small lamps no one could switch off. At 3:15 that same afternoon, Camille called with the bright, puzzled energy of someone who sensed a shift but not its source. And she said Nathan's parents were thrilled because a serious American partner had agreed to take a minority share and bring connections for the U.S. expansion. John said, "That sounds promising," and let her talk about pitch decks and timelines while he wrote in his notebook the date, the hour, the phrase serious partner, and the way her voice rose on the last word. That evening, Nathan called, voice slick with self-congratulation, to say the deal was happening and the family was leveling up. And he told John he probably wouldn't understand the financials, but could certainly open a bottle when we launch. A little laugh floating behind the words like foam. John said, "Congratulations," and meant it in the narrow sense a craftsman means it when he sees good oak used for a poor table. The next morning, the intermediary confirmed the placement. Shares issued, registry updated, counsel satisfied, documents signed by Luke and Marianne with precise signatures that looked like they had been practiced for years. John read every page twice, then printed a formal letter on fine paper with a watermark you could feel with your fingertip. He signed it L.S. Moreau, the new legal self that fit like a well-cut coat. And he wrote to Luke and Marianne as a recent minority investor who would be passing through their region and would value a dinner to meet the family behind the wine. He kept the tone neutral and warm, then added one careful line. "If your son and his wife are active in the enterprise, I would be honored to meet them as well." The reply came in 3 days, tidy and correct, with acceptance and a suggested date. The 23rd, at a private room in a restaurant they named with pride. John folded the letter, placed it in a slim file marked Moreau, and called the airline. He booked a flight that would land in the afternoon, a hotel under the Moreau name, and a car service with a driver who had no reason to speak to anyone about anyone. Then he turned to his desk and did the work he trusted most. He learned.
He printed the Lemaitre export filings, the customs codes, the distributor shortlists, the margin estimates, the weather charts for the last 5 harvests, the permit timelines for California and New York, and he tacked the lean pages on a corkboard in rows, not to show off, but to see the story. He called an old contact in Bordeaux who still knew which barrels were truth and which were theater. And he asked 2 simple questions. Was the wine good, and were the numbers honest? The contact said the wine was better than the story around it, and the numbers were good enough if pride did not do the driving. John thanked him and drew a small arrow on the margin by pride. The day before the dinner, he had the new suit delivered. Charcoal, not black, a white shirt with a fine texture you could see but not name, a tie the color of iron, and shoes that matched the tone of his voice when he was done being polite. He practiced one thing in the mirror, not a speech, not a face, just the pace of his breath, so he would not hurry when others did. At noon on the 23rd, he received a short call from Thomas, who said the Lemaitres were pleased and uneasy in equal measure, which meant they had felt the weight of a new chair at their table. John thanked him again and walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one, a habit that kept him focused. He checked the envelope with the original dinner transcript and placed a copy of it and a translated cover note into a second folder labeled, "If Needed." Not because he planned to wave paper at a meal, but because facts have a way of making people sit straighter when the air gets thin. The car arrived on time. The sky was a clear blue that didn't promise anything. At the hotel, he checked in as Moreau, carried his own bag, and laid the suit across the chair. He ironed the shirt himself, a small ritual, then sat for an hour with the file open and read every line again, lips moving without sound, the way he had read contracts in Bordeaux when the stakes were quiet but real. At 5, he dressed, slid the slim card case with his new name into his inside pocket, and stood still for a count of 10, feeling the balance of the shoes, the fall of the jacket, the steady pulse that did not rise. At 6, he rode to the restaurant, watched the city pass and clean windows, and thought of Camille as a child counting steps between lampposts, thought of the way she had said, "Call me when you get home," and promised himself he would make this night serve the truth without burning what did not need to burn. At 6:40 he arrived, spoke his name softly to the maitre d', and was led to the private room with frosted glass and a long table set for 6. He sat where a host would sit, not because he needed the head of the table, but because it sent the right message without a word. He placed his hands flat for a second on the linen and felt the small roughness of the weave, a signal to be patient. At 6:58 he heard steps in the corridor and a pause at the door. He looked once at the closed folder by his elbow, then at the empty glasses, then at the candle, a single small flame, and he let his breath settle into the slow count he had practiced. When the door opened, he kept his face still and his voice ready, not for a scene, but for a meeting that would begin with silence and end with everyone knowing a different shape of.
The maitre d' opened the frosted glass door at exactly 7, and Luke and Marianne stepped in first with the calm faces of people who believe the room belongs to them. Nathan, John's black son-in-law, following a half-step behind with a host's smile that showed more teeth than ease, and Camille beside him, steady but unsure. John rose from the chair at the head of the table in a charcoal suit and white shirt and said in clear French, "Bonsoir, merci d'être venu," then waited as their eyes adjusted to the fact that the investor they expected was the man they thought they knew. The pause ran long enough to make the candle flame seem loud, and Nathan said in English, "Is this a joke?" while Luke's mouth closed into a line and Marianne touched her pearls as if checking a clasp. John kept his voice even and said, "My name for this investment is L.S. Moreau. The paperwork is clean. I own 12%. We have a reservation and a menu. Please sit." And he gestured to the places set with small folded cards that read, Moreau, Luke, Marianne, Nathan, Camille. They took their seats because people do when a table tells them what to do, and the first course arrived, scallops in a light foam with a line of chive oil, and the waiter poured a white that smelled of stone and lemon. No one lifted a fork but John, who cut one clean bite and said, "Good," like a fact. Nathan leaned forward, hands flat, and said, "You deceived us." And John answered, "I made an investment through a legal entity, announced myself, and asked to meet the family running the business. That is not deception. That is process." Then he shifted to French and added, "Je vous ai entendu l'autre soir, chaque mot." And the way he placed "chaque" on the table made Marianne look at the door. Camille turned her head fast between the two men, her breath small but steady. Luke tried to move the moment toward control and said, in French, that investors are welcome when they remain silent and useful. And John nodded and replied, "Le silence n'est pas l'absence, il est un registre." And he tapped the edge of the menu with one finger as if it were a ledger line. The waiter returned to offer bread, and the room pretended to be normal for 10 seconds before Nathan said, "If this is about the dinner, you could have spoken then." And John said, "I chose to listen. Listening told me more about what I had to learn." And he turned to Camille and added, "I did not want to make a scene in your house." And she swallowed and said softly, "Thank you." The second course came, a small plate of greens with a thin shaving of cheese, and Luke asked, in English now, whether John intended to interfere with operations. And John said, "I intend to read numbers, watch decisions, and ask questions when the path and the story separate. That is called stewardship." And he set his fork down so gently it made no sound. Nathan tried a smile and said, "You're enjoying this." And John looked at him and said, "No, I'm correcting an assumption." And the plainness of the sentence put a draft in the room. Marianne lifted her glass and found it still full, then said in French that business must be kept free of personal theater. And John answered in the same language that the theater had already been staged at a family table and that tonight was simply the lights turning on. The red came with the third course, duck, crisp skin, a stripe of reduction, and John ate, not because he needed the food, but because eating set the pace, and pace matters when other people are burning faster than they think. Nathan said, "You cannot hold this over us forever." And John replied, "I am not holding. I am present." And then he laid out in 3 short points what he expected as a minority partner. Clear quarterly reports, a timetable for U.S. compliance filings, and a distribution plan that matched inventory instead of pride. Luke's eyes sharpened at the word pride, and he asked how John knew to press that point. John said, "Because I read your weather charts and your barrel counts, and I lived through 2 harvests in Bordeaux when spring bragged and autumn punished." And that made Luke's mouth change shape from offense to calculation. Camille sat very still, then asked the first question anyone had asked her father all night. "Why didn't you tell me about France?" And John said, "You built a life, and I did not want to turn my past into a banner. If you had asked, I would have told you everything." And her face softened in a way that held both apology and resolve. The waiter cleared quietly and set down the tarte tatin on small plates that shone like mirrors. And Nathan tried one last pivot and said, "If you care about Camille, sell your share and leave my parents to run their business." And John turned to him, not unkind, and said, "If you cared about Camille, you would not have laughed at her father in a language you thought he could not hear." And the sentence landed without a raised voice, "Just wait." Marianne pushed her plate away as if sweetness had turned bitter. And Luke said the company could buy back the stake at a premium, tomorrow if needed. And John shook his head and said, "Not today. Today we eat, and tomorrow we work." And he allowed one small thing then. He slid a slim envelope from his inside pocket and set it on the table, but did not push it toward anyone. "This is not for a scene," he said. "It is for the file." And the thick paper sat there like a folded thought. No one touched it. The waiter reappeared with coffee, and John took his black and let the heat sit in his hands. Finally, he stood, not abruptly, just enough to signal the end, and said,
"Thank you for your time. I will expect the first distribution draft within 2 weeks. Send it to the address on the letterhead. Good night." And he switched to French for the last line, quiet and plain. "On fait mieux quand on se regarde en face," which made Luke nod despite himself. Chair scraped, the staff moved in, the private room changed back into a room for anyone. And in the corridor, Nathan tried to recover the posture of a man in charge and said to John, low, "You think this makes you powerful?" And John answered, "No, it makes me responsible." Then he looked at Camille and said, "Shall I call you when I reach the hotel?" And she said, "I'll call you." And the 4 of them, Luke, Marianne, Nathan, Camille, walked away in a line that was not as straight as when they had entered. John remained a moment, signed the bill as L.S. Moreau with a hand that did not shake, and slipped the merchant copy into the folder with the neat label. Outside, the night air felt honest. He did not look back at the window. He walked to the car with the slow pace of a man who knows the next step is simple. Keep watching, keep asking, keep every word where it belongs, so that when the time comes to speak again, there will be no drama.
They left the restaurant in a slow line, the corridor quiet behind them, and John stood for a moment under the awning to feel the night air and count his breath before he walked to the car. He did not rush, because rushing breaks the line of a day, and this day needed to end straight. At the hotel, he hung the suit, placed the folder marked Moreau on his desk, and called Camille as promised. And she answered on the first ring, her voice low and steady, and she said she was going home with Nathan for the night, but would come by his house in the morning. He said, "Drive safe," and that was all. He slept without dreams, woke before dawn, and took the first flight back. By noon he was in his kitchen again, making coffee and slicing the same crusty loaf, the sound of the knife on the board like a small clock. At 12:10, the bell rang and Camille stood in the doorway with a bag and a tired face, and John stepped aside and let her in without questions. They sat at the table with mugs between their hands and told the hours in order. The drive home in silence, the way Nathan spoke too fast, the way she had felt her stomach turn when he said the word sell as if marriage were a lever. John listened, not to fix, but to hold the shape for her so it would not fold. She asked to stay for a few days, and he said, "Stay as long as you need," and showed her the guest room where the old quilt waited and the good lamp still worked. That evening they cooked simple food, eggs, tomatoes, a pan of onions, and ate it on the back steps while the light slid off the fence. The next 3 days fell into a calm pattern. Camille swept the porch, watered basil, found her school sketches in a labeled box in the attic, and laughed at the crooked hands she used to draw. John went to his desk each morning, read emails from the intermediary and counsel, and made neat notes on a yellow pad about compliance timelines and distributor calls. He did not poke, he did not crow, he simply kept the record straight. On the 5th day, the doorbell rang at 3:12 p.m., and Nathan stood on the porch in a pressed shirt and expensive shoes and nothing in his hands. And John opened the door only as far as he needed and waited. Camille came from the hallway and said she would speak to Nathan outside, and John stepped back but stayed where he could be seen through the front window because presence can be a safety. The talk was short and clear. Nathan said John had ruined everything and must sell the stake if the family was to move forward, and Camille said that moving forward was not the same as pretending nothing had happened. When he said again that John must sell, she asked if his love for her required her to betray her father, and the answer was not an answer. She told him she was staying at her father's house until she could hear herself think, and if he wanted a future, he would start with an apology and the truth. Nathan's mouth worked, but the words did not settle. He looked at John through the glass with a look that mixed anger and surprise, then walked to the car and drove away. The porch went quiet. Camille came back inside, closed the door, leaned her head to the wood for one long breath, then stood straight and said, "Thank you for not speaking for me." And John said, "You did not need me to," and put the kettle on. That night she cooked the food she loved as a child, pasta with butter and pepper, a salad with lemon, and they ate at the table with the good plates and the old radio playing soft. She said she wanted to think about school again, maybe law, maybe policy,
something that used her mind in a way that belonged to her, and John said, "I will help you plan," and meant it. The next morning, before the sun burned the mist off the lawn, John sat at his desk and prepared the envelope he knew he would send to Nathan, because some endings must be written down.
First, a clean copy of the transcript from the dinner, French on the left and English on the right, with small footnotes that marked tone where tone had carried the blade. Second, the acknowledgement letter from the Vineyard Council confirming that L.S. Moreau Partners held a 12% stake registered and paid, with all rights and duties that came with it. Third, a handwritten card in his careful script, one line in French and one in English. Je vous ai entendu pendant longtemps. Maintenant c'est mon tour. I heard you for a long time. Now it is my turn. And beneath that, a plain sentence. You will act with respect, or you will act under watch. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to Nathan at the house, and walked it to the post office himself, because that small walk matters. When he returned, he found an email from Luke, polite and tight, asking for a meeting to discuss governance. And John replied within the hour with 3 bullet points and 2 dates, and the calm tone of a man who did not need to be loud to be clear. In the afternoon, he and Camille drove to the market for oranges and bread, and she reached for his arm twice without noticing, the way children do when streets are busy. That night, rain came hard and clean, and they sat by the window and watched the drops track down the glass. Camille said she felt as if a room in her head had been closed for years, and now someone had opened the door, and the air was different. John said new air makes people speak differently, even to themselves. The following week, he joined a call with the vineyard accountant and asked 4 questions about inventory, permits, margin, and timing. There was no heat in his voice, only steadiness. He wrote down every answer and filed the notes in a folder he had started to call weather, because weather tells you what pride refuses to say. 2 days later, a courier brought a small box to the house, and inside was the original envelope he had sent after the first dinner, worn now, edges bent, and a single note in Nathan's hand. I received your message. I will send mine soon. John held the box for a moment, then put it on the shelf. He did not hurry to guess. He went back to his desk and continued the work. The mystery was not who would win, but who would grow. On Sunday morning, Camille stood at the kitchen window with sunlight in her hair and said she wanted to tell the children the truth in words they could carry without breaking. And John said he would be there, not to speak unless asked, but to be the room where her voice could land. He opened the back door and the smell of wet earth came in strong. He stepped into the garden and cut basil that this time actually needed cutting, and he thought how some stories turn with a shout, and some turn with paper and silence. His had turned with both, but it was the paper that would last. When he came back inside, he placed a small sprig on Camille's plate as if it were a blessing, and she smiled in the simple way that says a house is beginning to be a home again. Later, when the mail came, there was a thin envelope from France with the vineyard letterhead and a new calendar of filings and a short line at the bottom. Merci de votre attention. And John nodded once and slid it into the Moreau file. The record was clean, the next steps were clear, and the house was quiet in the good way. The game had ended the moment truth entered the room, and what remained was work and care, and a woman finding her feet beside a father who had never left.